When I saw a "dangerous" notice posted right next to my pool, I couldn't believe my eyes. It was one of those moments where time feels like it's standing still, and you're left staring at something that just doesn't make sense. The notice was clearly meant to be a warning, but all I could think was, how could my pool, the one thing I was so proud of in my backyard, be dangerous? My pool wasn't anything extravagant, just a small, well-maintained area to cool off during the hot summer days, with a secure fence around it and a lock on the gate. There was no way this was happening. But as I read the notice again, the words were clear: this pool is deemed dangerous by the HOA. Immediate action required to fill it in or face consequences. I stood there, frozen, wondering if I was missing something. How could something so simple, so harmless, suddenly be under attack? This pool had been the centerpiece of my backyard since the moment I moved in. It had given me peace, relaxation, and a place to unwind. But now, for some reason, the very thing that I thought was a simple luxury was being labeled a threat. And the most confusing part? The HOA had never given me any warning or even a hint that there was an issue. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. My mind started racing with questions. Had someone complained? Did the HOA board really think my pool was dangerous? I had followed all the rules, made sure everything was up to code, and ensured the pool was as safe as possible. So why now? Why was the HOA taking such an extreme stance against something so ordinary? At that moment, I realized that the peaceful life I had envisioned in my new home was about to be turned upside down. The HOA, with their vague rules and ever-growing list of complaints, had decided my pool was a problem. And from what I'd heard about them, once they set their sights on something, they didn't let go easily. The thought of filling in my pool was unthinkable, but it seemed like that was the only option they were offering me. Little did I know, this was just the beginning of a fight that would take everything I had to keep what was mine. The HOA wasn't just overstepping their bounds, they were trying to control my property in ways I never expected. I wasn't about to let them win without a fight. But first, I had to figure out what I was up against. I had to understand why my pool was suddenly under fire and what I could do to protect it, and my rights. Before it was too late, that I decided the first thing I needed to do was understand exactly what was going on. I wasn't about to just accept that the HOA could come in and tell me to get rid of something that had been built with care and consideration. There had to be a reason behind this, a real explanation for why they'd suddenly decided my pool was dangerous. I spent the next few hours researching HOA rules, specifically regarding pools. I found that most of the time, an HOA might step in if there were safety violations, like a pool with no proper barrier or a water quality issue, but none of that applied to mine. My pool was well kept, fenced off, and locked. So, why was the HOA trying to make a case out of this? I reached out to a few neighbors, hoping they could shed some light on the situation. Most of them seemed just as confused as I was, but one of them, Mr. Thompson, gave me a bit of insight. He told me that he'd heard whispers of the HOA being unhappy about a few out-of-place things in the neighborhood. He didn't go into too much detail, but he mentioned that the board was starting to scrutinize things more closely, including people's yards, fences, and even pools. It was starting to sound like the HOA wasn't just worried about safety, they were trying to impose stricter control over every little detail of property ownership. That made me more suspicious. The HOA had always been a bit controlling, but this was taking it too far. I began to wonder if there was a hidden agenda behind this sudden concern for my pool's safety. Had someone complained? Or worse, was the board trying to make an example out of me? I didn't know, but I was determined to find out. The next day, I went to the HOA office, hoping to speak directly to someone who could explain the situation. Karen, the woman leading the charge against my pool, was there. As soon as I walked in, she gave me a cold look and asked if I was there to discuss the pool issue. I tried to remain calm, despite how frustrated I was. I told her I didn't understand why my pool was suddenly a concern when it had been there for over a year without issue. She immediately jumped in, telling me that the community had raised safety concerns about my pool. When I asked for specifics, she just repeated that it was too dangerous and that it needed to be filled in, no exceptions. I pressed her further, asking if there had been any formal complaints or incidents that had led to this sudden action. She just shrugged, saying it was the HOA's decision. She refused to give me any concrete reason or evidence to back up her claim. It was becoming clear to me that this wasn't about safety at all. It was just the HOA trying to assert their control over something they had no business interfering with. Frustrated, I left the office without any answers. But I wasn't ready to give up just yet. I knew I had to stand my ground, especially if I wanted to keep my property rights intact. I reached out to a lawyer who specialized in property disputes and HOA conflicts. After explaining the situation, he assured me that the HOA had no legal grounds to force me to fill in my pool. He mentioned that unless there was a significant safety violation, such as a pool lacking a fence or being unmaintained, they had no right to demand that I remove it. This gave me some relief, but I knew the battle wasn't over. The HOA, and especially Karen, seemed determined to push this issue further. It was clear that the board wasn't going to back down easily, and I couldn't afford to be complacent. I had to gather more evidence and prepare for the possibility of a legal fight. The idea of taking on the HOA in court wasn't something I looked forward to, but I was willing to do whatever it took to protect my property and keep my pool intact. Over the next few days, I started gathering everything I could: photos of my pool, maintenance records, a map of my property, and anything else that would show that I was in full compliance with safety regulations. I even took the time to speak to a few other neighbors, just to see if they had experienced anything similar with the HOA. Some of them were hesitant to speak up, but others agreed that the board had been getting more and more intrusive with its policies. It seemed like the HOA was more interested in controlling personal property than actually protecting the neighborhood. I started preparing myself for a confrontation. I knew that Karen and the board weren't going to back down easily, and I was ready for whatever they had in store. The next meeting was scheduled, and I made sure I was fully prepared to defend my pool, my property, and my rights. This wasn't just about a pool anymore, it was about standing up to an overbearing authority that was overstepping its bounds. The HOA had chosen the wrong person to mess with. The day of the meeting arrived, and I was both nervous and determined. I knew I had all the evidence on my side, but the thought of facing Karen and the rest of the board still made my stomach twist. As I walked into the HOA office, I could feel the tension in the air. The room was full of people, and I immediately spotted Karen sitting at the head of the table, her arms crossed and a smug look on her face. She was clearly ready to make her case, but I wasn't about to let her bully me into backing down. The meeting began, and the board president, a man I hadn't met before, started by reading the complaint. He mentioned that several neighbors had expressed concerns about my pool being a safety hazard and that the HOA had decided to intervene. Karen jumped in, backing up the claim that my pool was too dangerous and that it needed to be filled in. She spoke as though it was a simple matter, as if she had already decided the outcome before the meeting even started. I couldn't just sit there and let them control the narrative. When it was my turn to speak, I stood up, trying to keep my voice steady despite the anger building inside me. I started by reminding them that my pool was perfectly safe and that I had followed all the rules when I built it. I showed them the documentation, the permits, the maintenance records, and the photographs I had gathered. I even pointed out that no one had ever raised any safety concerns about it before. It was only now, out of nowhere, that this issue had come up. Karen looked at me with disdain, clearly annoyed by my explanation. She tried to interrupt, but I held up my hand and told her that I wasn't done. I explained that the HOA had no right to dictate what I did with my property as long as I was following local laws and safety standards. I made it clear that I wasn't going to be bullied into filling in my pool simply because Karen or anyone else didn't like it. My voice was firm, and I could feel the board members starting to listen a little more closely. But then Karen dropped the bombshell. She claimed that the pool was a community safety issue, even though there was no evidence to support that claim. She argued that the HOA had a responsibility to protect the community, and that my pool was a liability. I could tell she was trying to make it sound like the board had no choice but to force me to fill it in. But her argument was weak, and I wasn't going to let it slide. The tension in the room was thick. Some of the board members seemed uncertain, exchanging glances as they listened to both sides. Others, like Karen, were still trying to push their agenda. I could feel myself growing more confident with every word I spoke, and by the end of my argument, it was clear that I had made a strong case. The board president paused, then asked the group for a moment of silence to discuss the issue. As they deliberated, I sat back, waiting for their response. I knew I had presented a solid argument, but I wasn't sure what the outcome would be. The HOA had a lot of power, and I wasn't naive enough to think they would just give up. Still, I felt a sense of relief knowing I had stood up for myself and made my case. After what seemed like an eternity, the board president finally spoke. He acknowledged that there had been no formal complaints or safety violations related to my pool and that I had presented a strong defense. He also pointed out that the HOA's jurisdiction did not extend to regulating private property in this manner unless there were clear safety issues. It was a victory, but Karen wasn't done yet. She shot up from her seat, fuming with anger. "This isn't over," she snapped. "I'll take this to the higher authorities. You'll regret this decision." I could see her face turning red with frustration, but I wasn't afraid. I calmly told her that I had done everything by the book, and I wasn't backing down. If she wanted to take the matter further, she was welcome to, but I knew I had the law on my side. The board president raised his hand, trying to calm things down. He said that they had reviewed the issue and, for now, the pool would not be forced to be filled in. He also reminded Karen that they would not tolerate any more complaints or threats against private property without solid grounds. Karen muttered something under her breath and stormed out of the room, clearly furious. For a moment, the room was quiet. The board members seemed to breathe a collective sigh of relief, and I felt a sense of triumph. I had stood my ground and won. The HOA had no more power over my pool, and I had proven that I wasn't going to let them take control of my property without a fight. I thanked the board president and the other members who had supported me, and I left the meeting feeling like a weight had been lifted off my shoulders. But deep down, I knew this wasn't the end of it. I had won this battle, but Karen and the HOA were relentless. I couldn't let my guard down just yet. A few days after the meeting, I thought things would settle down, but I soon realized I was wrong. The HOA, particularly Karen, wasn't backing down. I received another letter in the mail, this time much more aggressive. The letter claimed that I had failed to comply with the HOA's community safety guidelines, and that they were now considering further legal action. They didn't outright threaten to take me to court yet, but it was clear that they were trying to intimidate me into giving up. I knew I couldn't just ignore it. This wasn't just about a pool anymore, it was about my rights as a property owner. If I let the HOA continue to push me around, who knew what they would target next? My fence? My lawn? The thought of the HOA continuing to interfere in my life made my blood boil. I had to take action, and I wasn't going to let Karen get away with bullying me just because she had a little power in the neighborhood. I decided to reach out to my lawyer again. He was already familiar with the case, and after reviewing the letter, he reassured me that the HOA had no real case against me. He mentioned that HOA disputes like these could drag on for months or even years, but I had a strong position. If they tried to take legal action, they wouldn't have a leg to stand on. Still, he advised me to be prepared for anything and to keep documenting everything. He also recommended that I start gathering more support from my neighbors, in case the HOA tried to rally them against me. I took his advice seriously. I started talking to more of my neighbors, asking if they'd been contacted by the HOA or if they had any issues with the pool. Most of them were supportive and agreed that the HOA was overstepping. A few people told me that they had been warned about their own property concerns in the past, things like having too many lawn ornaments or parking issues. It seemed that the HOA had been steadily tightening its grip on the neighborhood, and people were starting to get fed up. It wasn't just about my pool anymore, it was about the HOA's growing influence and their disregard for personal property. I knew I wasn't the only one who had dealt with their ridiculous demands, and I wasn't going to let them make an example out of me. A week after receiving the threatening letter, I decided to take the matter to the local news. I wasn't sure how they would respond, but I thought it was worth a shot. I reached out to a journalist who had written several articles about HOA abuses in our area. She was immediately interested and asked me to come in for an interview. I shared my story, explaining how the HOA was overstepping and targeting my pool despite it being perfectly safe. I also mentioned the letters and the board's unwillingness to listen to reason. The journalist was sympathetic and seemed genuinely shocked by the HOA's actions. She assured me that she would cover the story and expose the HOA's bullying tactics. It was a risk, but I felt like it was the only way to get some attention on the issue. The more people knew about what the HOA was doing, the more pressure they would feel to back off. The story aired on the local news that evening, and to my surprise, the response was overwhelming. Many of my neighbors, as well as other community members, reached out to me, expressing their support. It seemed like the news coverage had sparked something in people. They were starting to see the HOA for what it really was, a group of self-serving individuals who thought they could control everything, even when they had no right to. The next day, Karen called me, but this time, her tone was different. She was no longer demanding that I fill in my pool or threatening to take legal action. Instead, she sounded almost apologetic. She told me that after seeing the news coverage, some of her neighbors had spoken out against her and the HOA's tactics. She admitted that she had been too aggressive and that maybe the HOA had overstepped its bounds. She even said that she was willing to move on from the issue. I was taken aback by her sudden change in attitude. A part of me wanted to gloat and tell her that she had lost, but I kept my cool. I simply told her that I appreciated her acknowledgement, but that I wasn't ready to forget how she had treated me. The whole situation had been frustrating, and I wasn't about to let her or the HOA off the hook so easily. But things started to calm down after that. The HOA sent me a formal letter apologizing for their actions and confirming that they would no longer pursue any legal action against me. They also promised to review their policies and make sure they didn't overstep in the future. Karen, according to the letter, had been advised to step down from her position on the board. I couldn't believe it. After everything that had happened, I had actually won. The victory wasn't just mine. It felt like a win for all the homeowners who had been pushed around by the HOA in the past, who had felt like they had no voice. The board had tried to intimidate me, but in the end, they realized they couldn't control everything. My pool stayed exactly where it was, and I could finally enjoy my backyard in peace. It wasn't just about the pool anymore. It was about standing up for what was right and not letting anyone take away your freedom. The HOA seemed to back off after that. Karen was nowhere to be seen, and the board stopped sending me letters. I still get the occasional question from neighbors about the whole situation, but most have moved on. The HOA learned that they couldn't just push people around without facing consequences. And as for me, I learned that sometimes, standing your ground is the only way to protect what's yours. A few weeks went by after the intense HOA battle, and life started to return to normal. The victory felt like a weight lifted off my shoulders. It wasn't just about the pool anymore, it was about standing up for my rights, and the lesson I learned was one I wouldn't forget. The HOA had pushed too far, but in the end, they were forced to acknowledge that they couldn't control everything, especially when it came to private property. Karen, who had once been so adamant about her position, seemed to disappear into the background. There were no more letters, no more phone calls, and no more threats. I was finally left alone to enjoy my property the way I always had. For the first time since the whole ordeal began, I felt a sense of peace. I could walk out into my backyard without worrying about what the HOA might do next. My pool remained intact, and I could once again enjoy the simple pleasures of sitting by the water, watching the sunset. However, the victory didn't come without its lessons. I realized how important it was to be prepared to stand up for yourself, even when it feels like the odds are stacked against you. The HOA had been relentless, but they underestimated my determination to protect my property. They also underestimated the power of community support. When neighbors who had previously been hesitant to speak out saw the coverage of the story, they began to rally behind me. They understood that if the HOA could push me around, they could do the same to anyone. That solidarity made all the difference. As the weeks passed, I found myself more engaged in the neighborhood community. I began talking to my neighbors more, learning about the struggles they had faced with the HOA in the past. It became clear that many of them felt powerless, just like I had. But now, they saw that one person, one voice, could make a difference. Some of them even started to speak up about their own issues with the HOA, and I was happy to lend my support. The sense of unity that had come out of the whole ordeal was inspiring. Looking back, I was proud of how I handled the situation. The legal advice, the gathering of evidence, and the decision to speak out had all paid off. The HOA had backed down, Karen had been forced to step down from the board, and most importantly, I had protected what was mine. It was a reminder that, no matter how small or seemingly insignificant the issue, standing up for yourself and your rights is never a wasted effort. You may face challenges, but in the end, it's worth it to stand your ground and keep what's rightfully yours. With everything finally settled, I found myself reflecting on the journey. It hadn't been easy, and there were moments when I doubted I could win. But as I sat by the pool, sipping a cold drink and watching the kids play in the water, I couldn't help but feel grateful. I had learned so much through the process, about property rights, community involvement, and the importance of not giving up when the stakes are high. And the best part? My pool was still there, just as it had always been, and I was able to enjoy it without any fear of losing it. The HOA had learned their lesson too. They'd pushed me to the edge, but in the end, they couldn't take away my rights. They had tried to intimidate me, but they underestimated how much I valued my home and my privacy. The battle had been long, but the victory was sweet, and I knew that I would never again let anyone push me around when it came to my own property. As the seasons changed and life moved on, I kept my pool, my backyard, and my peace. The lesson I learned from this experience wasn't just about winning a battle, it was about the importance of standing up for yourself, no matter how difficult it may seem. And as long as I had my rights, I knew I would never let anyone take them away.